On this episode of Skeptiko,
you've looked at these people square in the eye. You sat in the seance session, and not that you're infallible or can't be fooled at all, but that I think the journalist in that position is somebody I kind of trust more.
Even though I did have my own personal experiences, which really affected me, at the same time, I remained in the role of a journalist, and I even analyzed my own experiences that way. Of course, there were lots of things I read and people I spoke to that were not included in the book. I mean, you spend a lot of time dealing with material that you aren't going to use for one reason or another.
Stay with us for Skeptiko.
Welcome to Skeptiko, where we explore controversial science and spirituality with leading researchers, thinkers, and their critics. Today's guest is a really good one, but I feel it needs a little bit of a background. Maybe it doesn't, but maybe it does. I don't know. Today's guest is Leslie Kean, and a few years ago, she made quite a splash with her book about UFOs. And the book was really interesting because Leslie is very mainstream journalist, all the credentials. So when she turned her eye to UFOs and she published this book, it really drew a lot of people into that field that weren't in it before. It legitimized it in a way. At the same time, there were a lot of people in the UFO community who were kind of pointing at the book and going, hey, wait a minute, we've known about this for the longest time. All this stuff has been out there. Everyone's talked about it. Everything's been said about it. So the kind of interesting backstory here is, how do these controversial issues move forward? And what brings people from the outside of an issue, like if you're outside of NearDeath Experience or you're outside of UFOs? And then what brings you to saying, hey, you know what, maybe I need to really look at that. Maybe that's something serious. And that's what I think Leslie brings to this. She certainly brought that to the UFO issue. Unquestionably, she opened up the field and legitimized the field in a way that was really unique and powerful. So I think the exciting thing about her new book is to wonder whether or not the same thing will happen for the survival of death issue and the issue of consciousness and extended consciousness and consciousness after death and psi consciousness and all the other stuff that we talk so much about on Skeptiko. So it was really exciting to talk to her. I think her book is really important. I hope it turns out to be really important because, as we all know, there's a long way to go in terms of changing the paradigm that we're in regarding consciousness. Here's my interview with Leslie Kean. Today we welcome Leslie Kean to Skeptiko. Leslie is an investigative journalist with a long list of credits from many, many major news outlets. But you may also know and remember her from her 2010 New York Times bestseller, UFOs, Generals, Pilots, and Government Officials Go on the Record, a book that drew quite a bit of attention. And now, well, she's back with another thumb to the eye of conventional paradigms. She has a new book out titled Surviving Death: A Journalist Investigates Evidence of an Afterlife. Leslie, welcome to Skeptiko. Thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me, Alex. I'm really pleased to be on your show.
It is a great fit. I have to tell you and tell listeners that, this book is literally a must-read for anyone who's listened to the literally hundreds of shows we've done on the topic of consciousness and what lies beyond this kind of goofy mind equal brain silliness that science has us stuck in. So, we're going to talk a lot about the book, but just real quickly, what I thought was really interesting and unique is how you kind of synthesize together a bunch of stuff that a lot of people have covered maybe separately, but not together. So NDEs, but it's not just about that. It's about mediums. It's about psi, but all pointing towards this same thing of, survival hypothesis and afterlife. So you really be congratulated for that. Great job.
Well, thanks a lot. I mean, that was actually my intention, was sort of to show how the very, very best evidence, if you want to call it evidence or data, kind of synthesizes and all points in the same direction, and how things interconnect. Because so often, the topic is covered in just one area at a time. So as a journalist, I sort of wanted to provide an overview of the key, most incredibly evidential information that's there, and there are connections. So I think it's really interesting to look at those connections.
You just mentioned the journalist thing, and I really wanted to pick up on that because it comes through in the book quite clearly that you pride yourself on your profession, as you should. I get that. Investigative journalist means something. At least it used to mean something. Let's hope it still means something.
Exactly.
In the introduction to this book, Surviving Death, you write, an investigation of such evidence has rarely been systematically consolidated and subjected to in-depth, rigorous scrutiny by a journalist. And then you add, strict journalistic protocols can be applied to any topic for which there is data, no matter how unusual or even indeterminate. And this is something we can really kind of deconstruct because people are coming at it two ways. Some people are coming at it and say, great, here's somebody who really has the journalistic chops to dig into a topic and wrap their arms around it. And then there's going to be another whole group of people that are going to say, she's a journalist. What does she know about this science stuff? And you're going to talk about a lot of medical stuff in this book. How is she qualified? Tell us what you think about, your journalistic background and what that brings uniquely to something like this or, the UFO thing that you had to cover as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's a way that journalism approaches topics, which is to get information and sources that are extremely credible. You want to have multiple sources if you're reporting on something. You want to have physical data, stuff that's really reliable and very, very highly educated sources of information. Now, you're right. I can't possibly understand all the science, but a journalist's job is not to be a scientist. It's to report on what the scientists say and let them say it. So not only have I reported on what they say in this book, but in some instances, I've actually invited them to write their own chapters for the book. So we have some chapters written one by a famous cardiologist, another one by a psychiatrist. So I really, and I did this with the UFO book too. I love giving the experts an opportunity to speak to the readers directly, rather than me just quoting them all over the place.
The other thing I feel like when I read your book is I feel like, hey, here is a seasoned pro that's sitting down face to face with these people, and she's not going to let stuff slide. You know what I mean? That's the other part I'm getting from the investigative journalist part is that, you know what? And you even communicate that in the book that you've looked at these people square in the eye. You sat in the seance session, and not that you're infallible or can't be fooled at all, but that, you're bringing something there that I think adds a certain degree of credibility for people like me that a lot of times science doesn't even do. I mean, they're off in their own world of, trying to impress this journal or trying to get, they have a different set of criteria than somebody. I think the journalist in that position is somebody I kind of trust more.
Well, I hope that's the case, and I'm glad you feel that way. I hope it came through that way in the book, because I certainly, even though I did have my own personal experiences, which really affected me, at the same time, I remained in the role of a journalist, and I even analyzed my own experiences that way. So, yeah, I think that's really, really important. And the other aspect of that journalistic aspect is that, of course, there were lots of things I read and people I spoke to that were not included in the book. I mean, you spend a lot of time dealing with material that you aren't going to use for one reason or another. So I do feel that I have been careful to try to scrutinize a lot of stuff to kind of distill what I think is the most credible and the most important.
Yeah, I think that process is intriguing and it's important. As I was reading the book, couldn't help but wonder what some of the backstory is. I kind of was joking a little bit in the introduction saying, you're sticking another thumb in the eye of another paradigm, but it's true, right? I mean, yes. You were kind of all in on the UFO book, and I know that you took a ton of heat from all sorts of people on that thing. And you not only weathered it, but you kept coming at it. I mean, it wasn't just the book, but then you were interested in following up on the freedom of information and all the different things. So tell us a little bit about your background, because I don't know a lot. Your bio, sometimes you read it and it sounds like you're placed right in the middle of a successful award-winning career as an investigative journalist. What has been your background getting up to this point and up to the point of writing the UFO book that was the New York Times bestseller?
Well, I was when the UFO thing came into my life for a number of years before that. I had been working at a public radio station in California. It was KPFA Radio, which is part of the Pacifica Network, and I was a host and an on-air host and a producer for a daily investigative news program on that network. And while I was working there, I also was learning journalism. I was mentored by a very accomplished investigative reporter who worked at that station. We did a lot of writing together, publishing articles together, and that was sort of how I learned about journalism. It was by doing it with somebody guiding me. I had been to Burma, and I was very interested in the struggle for human rights in that country. And so I kind of got my career in journalism going by reporting on events that were taking place in Burma. So that had nothing to do with any of this kind of stuff. But then when I was working at the radio station, I think it was in 1999, a colleague in France sent me this report written by a lot of very high-level military people in France called the Cometa Report. And I won't go into a lot of detail because I don't want to take up too much time, but it was about these high-level officials' study of the UFO subject, essentially the official data, official cases, pilots and military people. And the conclusion that they drew was the possibility of the extraterrestrial hypothesis being valid. I mean, they actually said this is a valid hypothesis to explain these incidences. We can't think of any better ways to explain it, but we can't prove it. So anyway, that's what got me started, because I looked at that report, Alex, and I thought, like, this is huge. This is a big news story, right? You've got high-level generals and admirals telling us that we're being visited by extraterrestrials, very likely anyway. And I thought, what if this happened in America? So I just grabbed this story and I wrote about it for the Boston Globe in the year 2000. And that's what got me started on this with the UFOs. And I spent over a decade full time on them. I eventually left the radio station. And so that was sort of my first involvement with this sort of, I don't think of UFOs as being paranormal. I don't know how you want to qualify them, but certainly something that challenges the paradigm and certainly something that science doesn't accept.
Yeah, but Leslie, you had to be getting a lot of signals along the way that this isn't necessarily the greatest career move to go down this path. Because on one hand, it's this huge story, but a lot of folks have gone down there a little bit and said, hey, I just need to back off here. This isn't going to turn out the way I had hoped. You had to encounter that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I was certainly, especially in the beginning, and I described this in my book about how terrifying it was really for me professionally to write, to even be interested in this. It was only after the story was published in the Boston Globe that I felt even safe enough to tell my colleagues at this progressive radio station that I was interested in the topic. So there certainly was a lot of ridicule that I had to deal with, but I think the other thing that kept me going was I had other sources of income. I wasn't 100% dependent on this for my livelihood. Mm-hmm. So I think that if anybody was, they could never, maybe there's a couple of people that have made a career out of this, but not very many are able to do that. So fortunately, I had the opportunity to be able to focus on it. And, because of the approach I took, Alex, I really didn't get a lot of flack from the outside world about it. I think I was taking a journalistic approach that was fairly unique. I wasn't drawing conclusions about what the phenomenon was. I was just focused on giving the data that a phenomenon exists. That alone is extraordinary. But the problem with so many people who study UFOs, they just jump to all these conclusions and they're not clear about what's factual and what isn't.
Well, it's hard not to. But I think your book was really the right book at the right time. And maybe some people in the UFO community were clamoring for more. Hey, more. Why doesn't this go far enough? But when you look at it in retrospect, it was really the right book at the right time. And I wonder, I can't help but think if there aren't parallels with surviving death. Did you feel the same kind of parallels? Because first thing I have to point out, and you mentioned this in the book in passing, but you've had an interest in this survival thing for a long time too. So Was that, like the UFO thing, also something that was kind of brewing for a while, and now you felt like the time was right to package it in this way? Or what is the backstory for the book?
Yeah, and just to clarify, too, I know the documentary you mean about the case in Scotland. I had nothing to do with that. That was a Channel 4 production in the UK. A very excellent.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but I was involved with a documentary that was made about the skull experiments. So you may be thinking of that one.
What is the one? I actually saw the picture of you and I thought it was Cameron, the kid.
Mm-hmm. But not with Jim Tucker. I mean, I did meet Cameron, the kid, in that movie. I went up with a filmmaker named Tim Coleman, who was the producer of this documentary about the issues of survival. And I was assisting him, and I went with him to meet Cameron and his mom and his brother. So you may have seen a photograph from that.
Okay, I made the wrong connection then. So you were aware of that story and what was going on, but you were looking at the skull experiments, which are just mind-boggling as well. Well, right. and tell folks, because I'm bouncing around and talking about stuff that people probably aren't even familiar with, and those are two topics that you talk about in this book, and you draw these connections together. One is the physical mediumship that was demonstrated in the skull experiments, and the other is Jim Tucker does contribute to this book in terms of reincarnation. So however you want to pick that up in terms of what's in the book or how long that interest was there for you in those topics.
Yeah, I mean, all those topics have interested me for a long time. And when I think it was in the early 2000s, I was working on my UFO stuff, but I knew these two colleagues who were also involved with the UFO subject, but I sort of helped them develop a proposal for a documentary on this topic. And they ended up doing a film, and I ended up assisting with that film. So I got to meet a lot of the players in the field, but I wasn't able to fully participate because my priority was UFOs, and I was working on the book for that and everything and doing a lot. But this subject matter has always really interested me. It's always been sort of in the background of my work. And, I've poked around with different things involving it, the reincarnation cases, the physical mediumship, both fascinating to me. And then one thing that happened was in 2011, I was present when a very close friend of mine died. And, at the very moment that person took their last breath. And that was something I'd never experienced before. And it was very profound for me to be there for that moment. And it brought up a lot of deeper questions in me. And it sort of hit me over the head, like this personal experience that made me want to understand more about how it's just so, I don't know if you've ever been with a dying person, but it's very surreal when they're suddenly there 1 minute and then they're gone. It's hard to comprehend. And so that kind of also stimulated me to sort of want to discover more about the whole survival question. And I started to, once the UFO book calmed down, the effects of the UFO book calmed down, I started to poke into this a little bit more deeply. And then I had the opportunity to do another book on it. So it was, an opportunity I definitely wanted to take.
So how did all that shape your approach to the book? Because there are these, the approach to the book is great. Again, it's this synthesis. It's coming at it kind of as this straight on investigative reporter. Look, I looked at this. These things are happening. I'm talking to the best experts. Here you go. Here's the evidence. So you're having some personal experiences that are really kind of probably touching you really deeply, but you're pulling back from that a little bit in the book and kind of laying it out in a systematic way. What was your thought process and what would be the right book at this time to kind of get this stuff out there?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you ask about the relationship to the UFO book because it does sort of follow a similar pattern for me in that I'm providing data. I'm not drawing a lot of conclusions that can't be proven, but I'm willing to explore various conclusions. And I also include chapters by others, which I did in UFOs, because I just think that adds a great deal to it. So it sort of follows a similar kind of pattern, I guess. The difference was, though, Alex, is number one, that I didn't spend 10 years in looking into this. So it was a journey of discovery for me while I was actually researching it, while I was writing it. I didn't really know how it would come out when I started. Certainly in terms of my own personal experiences. I mean, these were things that I never knew would happen. So it was a more sort of a personal journey for me, and more of a discovery process in a shorter period of time than the UFO book was. And it also is more difficult to deal with for me because it's much harder to pin down this information. It's from a lot of different areas. I felt that I could have written 3 books. There was so much that I felt I had to leave out because it spans such a wide area of research, and it's just more difficult for me to talk about it. It seems more complicated to me than the UFO topic. So in that sense, it was sort of a step into a bigger, more challenging work.
Oh, I can definitely see what you mean, and I think people will appreciate that when they pick up the book. And by the way, that's also what makes this. You can't help but say this. This is the kind of book people are going to want to buy and give to other people, right? Because if you've been exposed to this material, like some people are exposed to near-death experience science, and then they kind of let it slip at the dining room table, and somebody kind of fires back, and it's like, until you look bigger and bigger and bigger at, well, it's not just near-death experience. It's all this other after-death communication. And then it's the mediumship. And then it's like you get deep into the psi stuff, the parapsychology stuff. And you felt the need to do that, and it comes through. You do a nice job and talk to a lot of the leading psi researchers whose conclusions don't necessarily line up with what the mediums and the NDE people are saying, but you're just kind of laying it all out there saying, we have to look at what all this stuff is pointing to because it's all pointing in the same direction regarding consciousness. So that is kind of tough, isn't it?
Yeah, I felt like I was dealing with a massive arena, of information and of unanswered questions and of mystery. And, so I do think making the connections, as I said, between all the different areas is really what sort of holds the book together. I mean, I feel like there's a unity to it, and it builds. And what I do also, Alex, is I try to start with the things that are more accessible to people. It's things that are, not going to seem quite as weird. And then I take them gradually through a sort of a progression of more advanced and more unusual and more dramatic phenomena, and ending with physical mediumship, which is the thing that is the most difficult for any person to accept, understandably. But I'm hoping by the time I get there, they have enough background from what they've read before that they might be able to accept it. And that's, so that's important to me. And that's sort of why it's often hard for me to talk about some of these things out of context, because I feel like the context is really important in terms of people being able to access and accept what some of this stuff is, because it's very strange.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about near-death experience science. It's something we've covered a ton on this show. You have an excellent chapter in the book from Dutch cardiologist Dr. Pim van Lommel. You say this is a journey for you. What was your biggest takeaway, learning points about near-death experience that you didn't know and you discovered?
Well, I think I think what's actually more interesting to me than the NDEs are the veridical out-of-body experiences. And we can they're very closely connected. But I think, of course, the universality of them is really important. And the fact that there's no adequate explanation that's been offered to account for all the different components of NDEs. I respect greatly the work of Pim van Lommel and others who have spent so much time, investigating them. And van Lommel's description in his chapter of the way he sees consciousness as being sort of in a field, and the brain is like a more of a receiver, not a producer of consciousness. I feel like he describes it so eloquently and so beautifully in his chapter, way better than I ever could. And he's the one that understands it. He's been studying it. So I think all of that is really, but the key component for me as a journalist, about this whole arena of NDEs and OBEs is when you have a veridical OBE, which is when somebody leaves their body as they experience it anyway, and are able to report back. This is leaving their body when they are completely clinically dead, meaning there's no heartbeat, there's no brain activity. They're going through some kind of a medical trauma or something. And when they are able to report back after they come back into their bodies, sights and things they've seen and things they've heard that correlate with real events, and they often will report them from a perspective of of the ceiling, say, which is often where they say they find themselves. So in one case, we have a social worker who was studied by Sam Parnia in a study he did with many colleagues, described seeing a bald. One of the medics was bald, and now he wouldn't have been able to see that very well from his bed, but he was unconscious anyway. But he was able to describe that. He was able to describe sounds that he heard that correlated with specific beeps that were being made at specific time intervals in a machine. So the point being that you can verify that the person actually was having perceptions when his brain was completely non-functional. And you can verify it because of what he reports back as being, and that's accurate. So that to me is really significant because it shows that consciousness seems to be able to function independently of the brain.
Now, you have to know this, but there's a ton of people that immediately are just going to push back and just scream because they scream at me whenever you say that the brain was non-functional or he was clinically dead or he wasn't really dead. You know, they have these discussions all the time. I'll tell you a couple of things I took out of the Van Lommel chapter that I thought were particularly significant. And I've interviewed him before and read a bunch of his stuff. But it came through as somewhat fresh. He very succinctly talks about the history with this. And he has been around for a long time. He's been a cardiologist for a long time. So you really get the sense of a medical doctor who really stumbled upon this and couldn't look the other way. I mean, he couldn't. He's like, look, before when I started my career, we weren't resuscitating anybody. You know, you had cardiac arrest, you were dead. That's it. And then with the advent of resuscitation, we started bringing more of these people back and you know, they started telling these stories. And then the way he kind of, as you said, goes through and, again, very succinctly says, well, look, we eliminated all the other possible explanations. And some of these people had a short cardiac arrest before they were resuscitated. Some of them had a long one. Still the same near-death experience, still the same depth, you know. Some of them had drugs, some of them didn't. Same experience. So we hammer on this near-death experience science because it so annoys neuroscience and science, medical science in general. I mean, it really flips it on its head. So there's a lot of pushback there. But right. I thought he does a great job of really just kind of laying it out in really clear terms.
And as you point out, I love his curiosity, Alex. You know, that he really was curious. He wants to know. He wants to understand. And he asks the question, too, in his chapter, you know, where is that curiosity in science?
Oh, yeah. Well, you know, and I want to get your opinion on this because it's something I've kind of hammered on for a while. But, you know, is it a lack of curiosity? Is it just a willful ignorance? Or I sometimes wonder if there's something else going on. You know, a few years ago, I interviewed this woman. Her name is Dr. Carolyn Watt, and she's the head of the Department of Parapsychology at Edinburgh in Scotland, which is one of the premier universities studying psi, you know, which is all in your book, all about the psi stuff and all that. And I don't know if you ran across this, but the title of her article is "There is Nothing Paranormal About Near-Death Experiences, How Neuroscience Can Explain Seeing Bright Lights, Meeting the Dead, or Being Convinced That You Are One of Them." And I have to tell you, Leslie, I mean, I still get messages, emails, whatever, from people saying, hey, you know, all this stuff, it's not real because this woman said it. I had her on. It's just a complete hit piece. The article is completely debunked. I had Janice Holden from University of North Texas, you know, good researcher, excellent researcher in this field, Dr. Jan Holden, come on, completely show. They misquoted Van Lommel. I mean, they just sloppily misquoted him. Is there some kind of, I don't know how organized it is, but sometimes when you see the reaction to the survival issue, and in particular, we're talking about near-death experience, I gotta wonder if there's something else going on here in terms of the amount of pushback and the organized pushback that you get on this.
Yeah,
what are your thoughts?
I'm sure you know more about that than I do because you probably talk to more people than I do. But it's certainly in the UFO field. I mean, there were people who were absolutely committed. It's people like the Psyscops. They have a mission. They're absolutely committed to debunking this no matter what the data. I mean, that's their preconceived position that it can't possibly happen. And they will go to any lengths, no matter how dishonest they are, to debunk things. And I don't know if in this field, I haven't been involved with it as long. I don't know if there's just people that have that commitment for whatever reasons, but I'm sure you know more about it than I do. And why somebody who studies parapsychology from like her would be so close to this, it's beyond me. But I can't provide an answer for what the root of that is. And maybe it's a combination of a lot of factors, and it's different for each person that pushes back. They have different reasons for doing it. I don't know.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about, that's a tough one too, but let's talk about religion and more broadly about spirituality and beliefs. And I think as it ties into maybe the purpose of the book, again, the short excerpt from the introduction, the very excellent introduction that does a great job of laying out the whole book, you write, what if we could develop a broad, unified view of what could be the reality of life after death based on facts, and thereby diminish the potency of competing, rigid belief systems? Is this the big picture goal that you have in mind to kind of wean us off of religion, I guess, is it religion and at the same time, atheistic scientism kind of thing? Is that where you're headed on this?
I mean, that's a loaded question, because certainly I'm not interested in challenging or undermining anybody's faith or religious beliefs or mystical beliefs or whatever, or beliefs are meaningful to them. But I do think that the information in this book doesn't contradict belief systems. I mean, I would hope that anybody, regardless of their belief systems or their religion, would be curious to know what the facts are, what really is when it comes to the question of an afterlife. And I tried to structure it in a way. First of all, this is not a religious book at all. I don't deal at all with religious concepts or philosophies and that kind of stuff, or speculation about what the afterlife is like, which, people have to leave that up to their particular faith or whatever. But I also don't think that the information in this book contradicts or challenges religion, because most religions do point for towards some kind of an afterlife, as I understand it. I'm basically not a religious person, but I don't see how this would contradict belief systems that believe in that. And it actually might help people reinforce their concept of an afterlife. So, the bigger picture of whether it could help undo the conflicts that people feel regarding belief systems. I mean, that's a kind of an idealistic hope that would be fantastic if
right.
we had facts, that we didn't have groups fighting with each other anymore about belief systems. That would be fantastic. So I just threw that in there as a potential purpose that information like this could serve in the world. If it gets out,
And I just have to say, but when I went the religious thing or the God thing, it's like, I wasn't trying to kind of lead you where you didn't want to go. But to me, it seems obvious. And I sometimes don't like when we kind of talk around the thing, it's like, I'll tell you, number one, I think that there are plenty of people that will be offended by the suggestion that, a medium is talking to the dead and that doesn't contradict their belief systems. Yeah, it sure as hell does contradict. A lot of people out there, fundamentalist Christians, just see it as, they'll just tell you it's all demonic. I've also interviewed, and I hate when we just can't handle this thing straight on, but I've interviewed a couple of people who are pretty prominent, best-selling books on Christian NDEs. And now their spin is to take it all and say, well, there's these people who have these, and we can't deny it. People have religious near-death experiences. People have religious after-death communication experiences. And by that, they see Jesus. Let's just stick to that. They see Jesus. And right. Jesus was crucified, and he told me to put my hand where he was, in his hand where it was up on the cross. And therefore, and you can go on, Dr. Jeff Long's website, the largest database of near-death experiences, and you can read one after another after another. What happens when I interview these people is I say, but that's not what the broader science says. The broader science says, yeah, you might have had that experience, but a lot of other people didn't have that religious experience. And overall, the data suggests the opposite of that we can't tie this survival thing to any set religious belief. So maybe I wasn't necessarily trying to lead you. It's just where I've been led is to say, hey, religion is all about this, and they care deeply about this. But I agree with you as well that, and I'm sorry, then I'll shut up. But, broadly speaking, this should be a huge boon to religion, because in the debate over whether there is something or whether there is nothing, it's something,
I know. Well, that's what I was really trying to say. And I have a very simplistic attitude about it because I haven't yet been the recipient of the pushback that will probably come. And I think I'll have to consult with you, Alex, when that happens, because, I'm just sort of naive, but I take the position that, yeah, this would be helpful to anybody with religious ideas. But as you're pointing out, if they can't accept mediumship, which means, I guess, that they might believe that after you die, you go to a place called heaven, but I guess they don't allow for that possibility that you could actually communicate from that place to this earth. That doesn't fit in within their worldview, I guess, so they can't accept it. But, maybe that'll open up some doors for some Christians to be happy that maybe they can be in touch with their loved ones from heaven. I don't know. I don't know how it works for people. I really don't.
Yeah, right.
I can't take care of that for people. I'm just trying to provide factual information and studies and reality here, and they can do what they want with it. But I hope it doesn't offend anybody. That wasn't my intention.
So we've touched on mediumship a couple of times. Tell folks a little bit about what that part of your journey was like, and what impressed you and what changed for you from that.
Well, we could start with mental mediumship. There's, of course, 3 types. There's mental mediumship, trance mediumship, and then physical mediumship. And my initial experiences were with mental mediumship, which means that the medium, maybe all your listeners know this, but the medium is in a normal state of consciousness and seems to have some kind of an antenna or some ability to tap into what she says are deceased people on the other side, and she's able to transmit information to the person receiving it, which is called the sitter. And, the sitter gets the feeling that their loved one still exists because of all the information that's provided that verifies that for them. And basically that's the process. And what I wanted to find some mediums who I could test under sort of my own personal controls, which I did. I had 2 extraordinary mediums do readings for me, and they were just way beyond average in their accuracy. The accuracy repeated itself between the 2 readings that I did. And the second reading, the first reading, none of them knew who I was, but as I mentioned in the book, the first reading, the medium had my phone number, but I'm not going to go into this. I just know that she didn't seek out anything about me through that phone number, but nonetheless.
Well, let's pause there for just a minute, because that's the first pushback that people who are, super skeptical and are trying to defend that position, they always throw out, oh, you were fooled and it's so easy for those people to dupe you. I've always kind of seen it the other way. I'd like to hear what your controls were, but my experience is that if you're going in and you say, I really want to control this and I don't care I just want to know that I really got the real deal, it's pretty easy to control it, isn't it?
Well, yeah. Here's what I did for the reading I did with the medium in Ireland, whose name was Sandra O'Hara. I used a fake name when I contacted her. I set up a completely separate email address that was completely different from my regular email address that didn't involve my name. And I only used that fake name when I paid her, and everything else, it was paid through PayPal. She had absolutely no idea of my name, my location on the planet, nothing about me at all. So to me, that was pretty good controls. And we talked through Skype when she did the reading, but she didn't know anything about me, not even my name. So there was no way she could have looked up anything in advance. And plus, the mediums will also often provide information that even if they did look you up, they couldn't find anyway. It's very personal. One of the people that came through for me was a sort of a public figure, but the other one was my brother that nobody could possibly know anything about. He's nowhere on the internet. So, anyway, so to me, I felt very comfortable with those being controlled situations. There's no way that this medium could have found out anything about me in advance. That was satisfactory to me anyway.
Yeah, and again, that goes back to the journalism thing. It's like when I'm reading that from you, I'm saying this is reasonable. Because sometimes the scientific stuff, and I know Julie Beischel is included in your book, and, she's fantastic. We've had her on several times, and I love her rigor, and she's into the science part of it, and, quadruple controls and quintuple controls and all this. What I liked was just, no, here's a person that seems like she's on the ball and she knows how to judge people, and she knows how to tell if she's being duped, and she was there and she didn't get duped.
Right. And so then therefore, with the level of accurate information that came through, it's just stunning to sit there and hear this information coming through from somebody who doesn't even know your name. And so I was able to do my own analysis afterward and figure out how accurate she was. And it was, there's two ways to explain it as far as I'm concerned. Number one, the deceased people were communicating through her, which is what she was absolutely 100% sure was happening. And I have to say that personality traits came through as well. It wasn't just information. Or the second possible explanation is that all the information was coming through the medium's own psi, through her own telepathy and clairvoyance, that she was basically reading my mind, but maybe doesn't realize that that's what's happening. As far as I'm concerned, there's no other way to explain this. And the issue is that many people in the scientific world won't even accept the psi explanation. So they have to come up with it being fraudulent in some way, but they can't do that either. So I'm kind of interested to see how they're going to respond to this.
Yeah, well, I am too, except I have no doubt that there will be no shortage of, possible explanations and way to kind of wiggle their way out of it. I think let's talk a little bit about the super psi explanation, because you do go into that. Like I said, this is not it's a very readable book, but it doesn't shy away from some of the science. So you talked to Dr. Stephen Brody about super psi and about that being a possible explanation. That never seems to be a very good fit for all the data. I know you have to throw it in there. I don't know if you want to just your opinion on that. You don't have to agree or disagree, but what did you think at the end of the day about the super psi explanation?
Well, I think there's some situations where it's much harder to use that, where it's just harder to conceive of it. For instance, materializations in the seance room of living things, or drop-in communicators or other things like that. Physical
characteristics on reincarnation and stuff. It's like, really?
Yeah, some things really push the psi explanation will push the limit, but nonetheless, we can't be sure. As Browdy proposes, perhaps the limitations, perhaps psi is completely unlimited in its capacities, and we don't understand that yet. So, but he himself will acknowledge that certain things really do push that envelope, and he leans towards the survival explanation, and he's incredibly rigorous in his exploration of the psi hypothesis. I recommend that anybody interested look at his work. So, I just think there are some cases that really push that. But then you can also argue that it's very hard to also argue them as coming from dead people. That's pretty weird too. Right. That's pretty unexplainable too. But it seems to me that you're kind of left in many cases with those being the only two options. Now you say that the skeptics are going to push back with other explanations, but I can't imagine that for these best cases that those other explanations are really going to carry much weight, but I'm waiting to see what happens.
I am too. I think, to kind of jump past that, where I think we're going to wind up is the other problem that we face. And that's that if we take the leap or even the step that you're suggesting we take, a lot of sand castles just kind of come crumbling down, because in the book, here's another quote from the introduction that is, I think, particularly relevant. You say, it's important to make clear what I mean by survival. This concept does not refer to an impersonal merging into pure awareness or becoming one with universal consciousness as envisioned by many who meditate or who are influenced by Eastern religions. Well, you've already talked about why you might have put that kind of qualifier in there, but I'm drawn to the first part of that, which is, once we jump into the survival of consciousness hypothesis and say, well, it doesn't look, guys, like it's so much of a hypothesis. It looks like that needs to be our starting point, our understanding, and go from there. Well, where do we go from there? Where do we go with spirits? What are spirits? What are good spirits versus bad spirits? Is there some kind of hierarchy? So you go back and you talk to the mediums, or particularly you talk to the near-death experience, and there's a hierarchical order, right? So these people they're having the out-of-body experience, which it's cool, and they're seeing the doctor has one brown sock and one blue sock and says, Doc, how come you didn't get your socks right this morning? He goes, how could you have seen that? But then he says, I went to this place, I met this being, and then I met these higher beings, and then there was this higher being beyond that. I mean, where do we stop in terms of trying to wrap our arms around all that may be in this thing called consciousness? It gets pretty challenging pretty quick, doesn't it?
Sure does. And there's plenty of questions that are unanswerable as far as I'm concerned, and probably always will be unanswerable. And I think that's the thing about near-death experiences. I mean, I think as a journalist, what's important about them is what's uniform about them is the fact that people do go into some kind of alternative realm and they are forever changed by that experience. I think those kinds of things are more important than the specifics of what they say occurred for them when they were in that realm. Because as you point out, the Christians will see Jesus and the Buddhists might see the Buddha, and there's a lot of differentiation according to what people's frame of reference is. So it's sort of, to me, more the essential nature of the experience that's important and how it affects people. So the rest of it, who knows the answers to all of that? And my point in the introduction that I was making, Alex, was that the book is concerned with the question of personal survival. It's not concerned with the question of some kind of, universal survival where we all kind of merge, but it's asking the question, do we survive in some kind of personal way where emotions and thoughts and psychology and memories are somehow carried forth into the next realm? And the reincarnation cases of children, really beg that question. I mean, that's why I opened the book with those cases. They really ask the question because it seems as if that's what's happened with these children, that personal elements of that previous life have survived and are in their awareness at very young ages.
No, I get your point, and it's a good one. I just think I relate also to the first way that you answered that, which is there's no limit to the number of questions that this directly brings to the forefront, So, like, we don't know if that personal survival is a prelude to merging into the universal, or, there's just no limit once we go there to, the questions we might ask, but we have to go there. And I think that's what you're obviously trying to do with the book.
I would agree. Yeah. I mean, to me, what's partly fascinating about it is the sense of wonder, the sense of mystery that it generates to have to come up against with these very strong cases and experiences and data about the world, the real world, and it shows that there's so much we don't understand about the physical world. There are forces in operation here that we can't explain and that science can't explain. And I like the fact that it opens up a door to sort of the mystery of the world around us. And we'll never be able to, I assume, answer a lot of the questions that are raised. But to me, that's part of what intrigues me about it, actually.
Yeah. Now, so with your UFO book, you not only kind of, you didn't just write the book and kind of sit back and go away. You became quite an advocate, and not just an advocate, but you really were out there in terms of advancing this issue. Do you see the same thing happening with surviving death?
It's a good question, Alex. I mean, I don't feel that I have this, I don't feel as much of an authority on this, to tell you the truth, as I do on UFOs. I mean, I spent 11 years on the UFO topic, and I felt in that book that I really brought forward all there is to say about it as far as I'm concerned. I could never imagine, it was sort of like the end of that journey for me, and I can't imagine ever doing another book on it or having a whole lot more to say other than advocating for change in terms of attitudes and in terms of government and things like that. But with this, it feels much more open-ended to me. And whether I don't feel like I'm some kind of an expert or authority on this information. I think my unique contribution here is applying journalistic standards to it, trying to be very objective and seeing how it all holds together. And maybe, being able to be a voice for bringing more credibility to this topic. I mean, and the other point, the real reason I wrote this book is to bring this material into the mainstream. I'm sort of like a vehicle for taking material that's scattered all over the place and that's been sort of marginalized by our culture, taking it into a book that can bring credibility to it, that shows that it's valid, that shows that it's serious, and then handing that out to the mainstream world, which to people who have never been exposed to it before. I mean, that's by having a big publisher like I do, a very well-established publisher. They have these people that really help get it out. And so my job is, as I did for UFOs, my goal is to take material that needs to have more credibility and recognition to it, that can change people's lives, and putting it into a form that is accessible to an intelligent and curious person who has not encountered this material before. So the book's really written for people who this is new for, and with the special approach that I have to offer. So that's sort of how I see my role in all of this. I hope that makes sense.
Oh, totally. And, the other thing that hints at, of course, is that, maybe your journey isn't over on this one. Like you kind of close the door on the UFO and say, my journey's kind of over. On this one, you're saying, hey, maybe my journey isn't over. So,
my God, it's not. I feel like it's just beginning, to tell you the truth. I have so much more I want to learn. I have stacks of books on my desk that I want to read that I haven't had time to read yet. And I want to be in dialogue with people. I have my website. I'm setting up these sections of my website for research papers and to post actual additional information that I couldn't include in the book, or papers that relate to things that I've covered in the book. So I also want my website to be a real vehicle for people to learn more. And that'll include my own explorations as I discover new things that might relate to something I wrote in this book, but that I hadn't discovered yet. I want to make that available to people. So I see this as sort of an ongoing process. Absolutely. And I'll be the first to say I have a lot more to learn about it. And who knows, maybe there'll be another book down the road, but it's a journey that has just begun, essentially, for me.
Great. And we'll be sure to link up to that website, but maybe you can tell folks what the URL is. Yeah,
the website is the name of the book, Surviving Death, and then it has my last name attached to it, which is spelled Kean. So it's survivingdeathkean.com. And I also have a very active Facebook page, and I love discussing this stuff with readers and taking questions and having their comments and having dialogues with people. So I really welcome people's participation.
Awesome. Well, it's been so great learning about this, and just something that people are going to want to check out. And I have to add that I appreciate the humility you have with the book, but I found a lot of good stuff in there. I've been looking at this for a long time. I found a lot of new stuff or just stuff that was slightly different that made me think in a new way. So if you're, even for people who are well versed in this, I think they'll find a lot. Again, the book is Surviving Death: A Journalist Investigates Evidence of an Afterlife. And our guest has been Leslie Kean. Leslie, thanks again so much for joining me.
Thank you, Alice. It's been really great talking to you. Appreciate it very much.
Thanks again to Leslie Kean for joining me today on Skeptiko. I guess I'd have one question to tee up from this interview, and that is, do you think this book will make a difference? That's how I kind of framed things up at the beginning, and I think that's still the question. I don't think there's a lot of information in this book that Skeptiko listeners will find particularly startling, although, like I said, I think there's a lot of good stuff in there, and it's consolidated and synthesized in a very cool way. But the real question is, will this energize more people, bring them to a point where they say, hey, I really have to dig into this stuff, even though I've kind of never really looked at it? Could this book be that tipping point for a lot of people? So let me know your thoughts on that. Of course, the place to do it is through the Skeptiko website at Skeptiko. While you're there, you can grab any of the 300 and almost 50 shows that we've done, and they're all up there for free, and you can download them and do whatever you like with them. And if you want to join in the conversation, you can do that too. You can join the Skeptiko forum, or you can leave me a comment or connect in any way you see fit. So I'm going a little bit out of sequence here. So this interview is actually recorded just a little bit ago, and then I have some other ones that are really good that I'm going to get out every week here for a while because these interviews pile up. I keep wanting to do the show every 2 weeks so I can have kind of a normal life, but then I just love doing these interviews, and there's so many cool people to talk to that I wind up doing a lot of interviews, and then I have to get them all out. And that's the case that we're at now. So just stay tuned every week for a while, and then every 2 weeks for a while, however it turns out to be. I'm just glad that you're here and joining me and hopefully enjoying this cool journey of discovery that we're on. So that's it. Until next time, take care. Bye for now.